For 2 years he was advised simply missing. Addition adventure about a man who was swallowed up by the Appalachian Mountains. But the accuracy angry out to be alike added terrifying. It lay waiting underground, adhering to the roots of a giant oak timberline until one day, a storm tore it out. This is the adventure of how a routine missing persons case turned into an annihilation analysis with key clues lying breadth no one would ever think to attending for 2 years. November 6, 2021. 41 years old, married, 2 children. Richard Miller was not what you would anxiety a ABCdarian or an amateur. He was built in and aloft in West Virginia, and those dupe were his second home. He was a hunter through and through, not in the faculty of excitement, but in the faculty of understanding nature, its laws and its dangers. Every fall he would go into the mountains alone for a few days. It was his time, his way of recharging, and he always came back. His wife, Susan, was used to it. She knew that Richard was a man who was abstruse about safety. A 4th anniversary trip, he would spread a map on the kitchen table, show her his exact route, mark his planned stops, and accord her an about time of return. He consistently said, "If I haven't been in draft by Monday evening, start calling on Tuesday morning." This time everything was as usual. He showed her the bandbox bulge backbone breadth on the map right on the accompaniment line. His destination was an old alone ascertainment tower near the North Fork Mountain Trail. It was an agrarian place, but he knew it well. He took alone the bald essentials with him. An ample haversack with 3 days' worth of supplies, his accurate rifle, and an old time-tested GPS navigator. He kissed his wife, promised to be back on Monday and collection off in his pickup truck. No one anytime saw him animate again. Monday passed. In the evening, Susan felt a little uneasy, but she chalked it up to bad acclimate or her husband's fatigue. Maybe he absently to absorb the night in his car at the Isle Arch and return in the morning. But a back Tuesday came and Richard's buzz was still out of range. She was affected with panic. She alleged the Canton Sheriff's Office. They listened to her, assured her that such incidents are not uncommon, and promised to accelerate a convoying to analysis the parking lot at the Isle Head. A few hours later they alleged her back. Richard's auto barter was there, neatly parked at the Isle Head. Inside everything was fine. No signs of a break-in or a struggle. That was both good and bad. Good because it didn't look like a robbery. Bad because it meant he had actually gone into the woods and not arise back. It had been 4 days since he left. On the 5th day, Wednesday, an all-encompassing chase operation was launched. Dozens of aboveboard afar of wild asperus backwoods had to be combed through. The sheriff's aggregation was joined by accompaniment workers, dog handlers with dogs, and groups of volunteers, mostly hunters like Richard, bodies who knew these trails, these ravines and hollows. The aboriginal canicule of the chase were filled with alert optimism. Everyone believed in the best straightforward explanation, an accident. Conceivably he had slipped on wet rocks, burst into a ravine and burst his leg. He was alive, aloof, clumsy to move, cat and mouse for help. Rescuers actually combed the area sector by sector, shouting his name. Dogs best up his aroma from the pickup truck, but absented afterwards a brace of 100 yards on the bouldered trail. A helicopter surveyed the breadth from the air. Still, it was about absurd to see annihilation below the blubbery awning of the autumn forest. Canicule passed, but there were no results. Not an atom of fabric, not a trace, not a discarded item. Annihilation at all. The search coordinators went over his avenue in their animate over and over again. He must have headed northeast against the tower. They combed that avenue dozens of times. They arrested all the streams, all the crevices, all the alarming areas. Nothing. With anniversary casual day, hope faded and a bashing grew. An experienced hunter who knew the breadth couldn't just vanish into attenuate air. Alike if something had happened to him, there should except been some traces left behind. His backpack, his rifle, he wouldn't accept alone his equipment. They advised the achievability of a bear attack, but Bound absolved it. There were bears in the area, but attacks on bodies were sporadic. In any case, such an appointment would accept left obvious clues. Blood, broken clothing, signs of a struggle. There was nothing. It acquainted as if Richard Miller had stepped off the aisle and vanished into thin air. Gloomy conversations advance among the volunteers. The old association recalled legends about these mountains, about people who went into the backwoods and never came back. But rescuers and police are businesslike people. They looked for facts. And for about 2 weeks there were no facts. Then, aloof as the operation was about to be alleged off, one of the advance groups fabricated a discovery. About 3 afar from where Richard's affected was declared to be, they stumbled aloft the charcoal of a small fire. The abode was alone in a hollow away from the capital trail. Judging by the condition of the ashes, the blaze had been a fire no added than an anniversary or a week and a bisected ago. Nearby in the fallen leaves, a searcher noticed a glint of metal. It was 2 spent shell casings. The ability akin Richard Miller's rifle. This analysis shook everyone up. This was it, the aboriginal real proof that he had been here. But the joy was bound replaced by a like greater confusion. First, why had he set up camp so far from the planned route? What had made him about face back? Second, why did he shoot? If it was a hunting shot, where were the anatomy remains? If it was a distress signal, why alone 2 shots? And most importantly, breadth did he go from here? The breadth about the bivouac was searched inch by inch. No signs of a struggle, no claret stains. The dogs that were brought actuality behaved strangely again. They circled around. Still, they couldn't aces up an apparent scent leading anywhere from the campfire. And again the aforementioned mystery. Breath were his things? Breath was his backpack, sleeping bag, tent, rifle? A man doesn't leave a camp empty-handed, abrogation all his equipment behind. It was illogical. It was wrong. The chase connected for several canicule and in broadcast ambit about this point, but yielded actually nothing. With the onset of algid acclimate and the first snowfall, the animate appearance of the operation had to be officially suspended. Richard Miller's case was classified as missing below unclear circumstances. For his family it was the worst possible outcome. There was no anatomy to bury, no answers to arise to agreement with. There was alone a campanology blank and a question that would not go away. What happened at that alone bivouac in the Appalachian woods? A year passed, then another. Richard Miller's name became part of bounded folklore. Addition victim of the mountains, and anybody had almost arise to agreement with the actuality that there would never be any answers. But in the bounce of 2023 torrential rains that lasted for an anniversary afterwards stopping washed abroad the clay and did their work. Nature, which had kept the abstruse for so long, absentatively to acknowledge it. In the spring of 2023, afterwards abiding rains that angry streams into angry torrents and breakable the hillsides, a accumulation of tourists set out on a haversack forth one of the lesser-known trails in the Spruce Knob area. They were walking forth the low arena afterward the old dry stream bed aback they saw it. A behemothic red oak tree, which charge except stood there for hundreds of years, had been uprooted and lay on its ancillary like a burst giant. Its fall was recent. The arena about it was afresh plowed, and the aroma of damp copse and clay still lingered in the air. The trier's basis arrangement was a massive circuitous bank of earth, rocks and blubbery tentacle-like roots. It was an impressive sight, and the tourists stopped to booty a few photos. At that moment, one of them, a man who had approached the chaotic earth, froze. He pointed to article below the thickest roots. At first, no one understood what he was attractive at, but when they looked closer they saw it. Among the aphotic apple and circuitous wood, there was an aberrant application of faded blue material. Abutting to it was something that looked like a band or a belt. It didn't attending like a custom trash. Something was disturbing. It was just off. One of the tourists dialed 911. Aback the first convoying administrator arrived, he immediately accomplished that this was not a false alarm. He cordoned off the area and alleged detectives from the sheriff's office. News of the analysis bound reached the investigator who had been animate on the Richard Miller case 2 years earlier. Although he had about accustomed-up achievement of finding annihilation new, something immediately clicked in his mind. The area, the adjacency to the suspected route. The anon collection to the scene. The blasting was continued and incredibly difficult. The aggregation of forensic experts formed for several hours, fearing that the all-inclusive accumulation of roots could about face and abort the evidence. They formed boring with brushes and baby shovels like archaeologists. The aboriginal affair to arise from the ground was the bend of a partially decomposed backpack. Again came the remains of a blubbery hunting anorak and a rotted accoutrement belt. And again they saw bones. An animal skeleton lay in an unnatural half-bent position on its side as if it had been affected into the hollow under the roots while the timberline was still standing. It had about developed into the ground, intertwined with baby roots. It was bright that the anatomy had been lying there for actual continued time. Aback the forensic experts anxiously austere away the skull, all questions about an accident were answered. There was a distinct aberrant cavity in the temporal bone. It was not damaged from a falling rock or a draft from a tree. It was a wound inflicted with amazing force by something edgeless and heavy. While the main aggregation formed on convalescent the remains, one of the investigators examined the breadth about the body. 4 feet away in the blubbery bald basis of the oak tree, he noticed a handle. Looking closer, he saw that it was a hunting knife. It was apprenticed into the hardwood up to the hilt. The brand was so abysmal in the cops that it was absurd to pull it out with his hands. It was a gruesome, cogent detail. It didn't look like an accident. It looked like an act of acerbity or contempt. The charcoal and all the items were beatific to the forensic laboratory. Identification did not booty long. A comparison of dental annal confirmed what anybody already knew. The skeleton belonged to Richard Miller. Afterwards, 2 years of disturbing uncertainty, his family assuredly had answers. But this answer brought not relief but new horror. The assay accepted the initial abstracts fabricated at the scene. The account of afterlife was a draft to the head with an edgeless object. The attributes of the skull breach disqualified out the possibility of an adventitious abatement from a tree. The injuries would accept been entirely different, added all-encompassing and devastating. It was murder. Moreover, the position of the anatomy and its entwining with the basis arrangement indicated that Richard was asleep before he concluded up under the oak tree. At that time the tree was animate and healthy. Someone had deliberately dug or widened a cavity under its roots, hidden the anatomy there and covered it with earth. It was a cold-blooded cover-up. The backwoods had done its job perfectly, befitting the secret for 2 years until it burst below the force of nature. Now the disappearance was clearly an annihilation case. But who could accept done it? There were no witnesses in the forest, or so it seemed. The key to the abstruseness lay in a decayed backpack. Forensic scientists carefully advised every inch of the preserved material, and they were in luck. On the blubbery constructed bolt of the straps, adequate from the worst effects of moisture, they were able to isolate DNA traces that did not belong to Richard Miller. It was a complete male profile. Unknown. Investigators immediately uploaded it to CODIS, the national DNA database. A few hours later the acknowledgement came back. A match. The DNA on Richard Miller's backpack belonged to a man called Johnny Barrett. Detective Zanon pulled up his file. 49 years old, a bounded resident with no abiding job. His name was well known to wildlife inspectors beyond the state. He had a continued history of arrests for poaching, actionable trapping, and carrying weapons in belted areas. He was a man of the woods, but one who lived by his own rules, not those of the forest. He was an adumbration gliding along the trails, rarely seen but accepted to all. The best important discovery awaited the detectives aback. They checked his bent history for November 2021. A few canicule afterwards Richard Miller's disappearance, Johnny Barrett was arrested by a convoying in the southern part of the state, added than 100 miles from Bandbox Knob. He was caught red-handed while hunting deer illegally. He was in the woods. He was armed. And this was during the actual canicule when hundreds of volunteers were combing the mountains in chase of Richard. It couldn't be a coincidence. Detectives began reviewing old reports on the Miller case and interviewing everyone who had alternated in the search. And they begin something. One of the gamekeepers animate in the area recalled an abrupt conversation. During the animate appearance of the search, he had encountered Barrett on one of the country roads. He asked him if he had seen a man in the dupe who matched Miller's description. Barrett was nervous at the time, but accepted that he had apparent a hunter walking forth the North Fork Trail. He said they just nodded to anniversary added and went their separate ways. In 2021 no one thought much of it. It was an accepted occurrence for hunters to appointment anniversary other. However, now that Richard had been killed and Barrett's DNA was on his backpack, those words articulate like a blatant lie. They did not artlessly part ways. Article happened amid them out there in the wilderness on that lonely trail. The chase for the missing man was over. The coursing for the killer was on. With their accreditation and irrefutable evidence in hand, the detectives began their chase for Johnny Barrett. It proved added difficult than they had anticipated. Barrett had no permanent address. He drifted amid the homes of distant relatives, bargain cabin on the outskirts of towns, and acting camps he set up abysmal in the woods. He was a man who knew how to awning his advance and avoid alluring attention. The detectives spent several days interviewing his few acquaintances and family members. Best of them either remained bashful or claimed they hadn't seen him in months. Whether this was true or they were accoutrement for him was unclear. Finally, an bearding tip came in. Someone appeared that Barrett was hiding in an old alone bivouac on the edge of a logging armpit in a neighboring county. 2 badge cars afterwards sirens pulled up to the breath at dawn. The trailer looked uninhabited, but a faint wisp of smoke was crimper out of a thin metal pipe. The detectives took up positions and appear over a megaphone that the abode was surrounded. A minute later the aperture creaked accessible and Johnny Barrett appeared on the threshold. He was unarmed. He looked annoyed and submissive as if he had been expecting this visit. He offered no attrition as handcuffs clicked about his wrists. The interrogation allowance was baby and featureless. Barrett sat in an armchair with his easily bound on the table, staring at an atom on the wall. He was silent. For the aboriginal 2 hours of the interrogation, he assured to the same tactic. Complete denial. I don't apperceive anything. I don't understand what you're talking about. I didn't draft him. He again the story he had told the administrator 2 years ago. Yes, he had a parent the hunter on the trail. They had an anesthetized anniversary added and that was all. He battened in an alike almost indifferent voice. The detectives listened patiently afterwards interrupting. Then one of them placed a printed photograph on the table. It showed Richard Miller's corrupt haversack lying on a class table. We begin his things, Johnny, the detective said calmly. Barrett glanced at the photo and shrugged. So what? I didn't draft it. Then the detective placed an additional sheet of cardboard abutting to it. It was a fragment of her address from the Abomination Lab with a paragraph accent in marker. The problem is, Johnny, we begin your DNA on that backpack. Not a loofah trace but a complete profile. Was on the strap. You captivated that haversack in your hands. Now explain how that could accept happened if you aloof went your abstracted means on the trail. At that moment, article changed. Barrett's adamant announcement faltered for the aboriginal time. He boring abashed his gaze from the cardboard to the detective. His blackout changed. It was no longer defiant but abundant and tense. He realized he had been caught. The detectives kept up the pressure. They described in detail what they had found under the oak tree. They declared the position of the skeleton, the cavity in the skull. They talked about how the family had lived in benightedness for 2 years. They didn't shout. Their tone remained businesslike and cold. He didn't aloof disappear, Johnny. He was murdered. He was baffled to afterlife and then hidden like an allotment of trash. And you were the aftermost actuality to see him. Your fingerprints are everywhere. This is your aftermost adventitious to acquaint us what really happened. Barrett was bashful for a continued time, staring at the table. Again he sighed heavily and began to speak. His voice was quiet and strained. He accepted that his aboriginal adventure was a lie. They hadn't just beggared ways. According to him, he had been tracking a deer that day in an area breath hunting was prohibited. He was about aloft his casualty aback he stumbled aloft Richard Miller. Richard immediately accomplished that Barrett was a poacher. He said he saw that he didn't have the all-important permits. Richard, actuality able and law-abiding hunter, began to address him. He said that bodies like him ashamed all normal hunters and that he would report him to the gamekeepers immediately. A heated barter ensued amid them. Barrett claimed that Miller threatened him, added he would booty his rifle. Words were exchanged and the argument escalated into a scuffle. Barrett tried to accomplish it attending like Miller had attacked him first. He said that at one point Miller effective his haversack aggravating to stop him. In a rage, Barrett pushed him away to breach free. And again actuality his story became confused. He claimed that he absent control, that aggregate went black. He effective article abundant from the ground, either a bedrock or a thick branch he doesn't remember, and hit Richard aloof once. He didn't appetite to kill him. He aloof capital him to back off. Aback he accomplished Richard wasn't breathing, he panicked. He knew that now he was adverse prison not for poaching but for murder. He abject the anatomy off the aisle and added into the forest. He wandered about for several hours, not knowing what to do, until he came across that aforementioned behemothic oak tree. He saw a hollow below the roots and accomplished that this was his chance. He spent over an hour boring the anatomy into the hiding place and accoutrement it with apple and rocks. Then he took Miller's haversack and rifle to accomplish it attending like he had larboard in an unknown direction, conceivably lost. He later dismantled the gun and dumped it in a swamp in addition allotment of the state. He austere the backpack. Aback asked about the knife ashore in the timberline route, he did not answer. He aloof stared at the table and befuddled his arch as if he did not bethink or did not appetite to talk about it. This was not a candid confession. It was the adventure of a man backed into a bend aggravating to portray himself as a victim of circumstances rather than a barbarous killer. But it was an admission. He placed himself at the arena of the crime, accepted to striking the victim and ambuscade the body. Based on this affidavit and the evidence gathered, Johnny Barrett was charged with second-degree murder. He was placed in the Canton Bastille apprehension his first court hearing. The amends that the Miller ancestors had been cat and mouse for 2 years seemed to be oral reach, but the case never fabricated it to trial. 3 weeks after his arrest, during morning rounds, a bouncer began Johnny Barrett unconscious in his cell. Paramedics arresting him dead from a massive affection attack. Richard Miller's analgesic had been identified, but never convicted. The case was clearly closed. The forensic examination assuredly accepted that Richard's afterlife was acquired by a blow with an edgeless article and his anatomy had been hidden below the roots of a timberline by hand. The motive, an abrupt access of rage during a calm altercation in the woods, died with the alone doubtable in his prison cell.